Imagine trying to negotiate a really complex international peace treaty. You've got diplomats, community leaders, and, centuries of historical tension all just sitting around a table.
Right.
Now imagine trying to enforce that exact same treaty while the actual ground you're standing on is actively turning to dust.
Yeah, literally disappearing beneath your feet.
Exactly. Today, we are looking at a place where the weather isn't just changing, it is actively erasing the map. Welcome to this deep dive.
Hmm.
If you're joining us, you are the kind of listener who wants to understand the hidden gears turning beneath the surface of global events.
Which is what we love doing here.
Always. And today our mission is to unpack this fascinating stack of sources centered around the Mercy Corps CCLAP report. That stands for Climate Change Leaders Advancing for Peace.
And we're not just looking at that one report, right?
Right, no. We're looking at it alongside UN guidelines, World Bank evaluations, and several deeply researched regional studies.
And we are zeroing in on a very specific, highly critical part of the world to see how this all plays out in real time.
We are.
We're looking at the Karamoja and Turkana borderlands. This is that rugged, semi-arid corridor right between Uganda and Kenya.
Which perfectly sets up the core theme of today's deep dive. We're looking at how climate change and human conflict are colliding head-on in some of the most fragile places on Earth.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because I want to be clear, right out of the gate today is not just about doom and gloom.
Right. It's actually surprisingly hopeful in parts.
Yeah. It's about a surprisingly effective, community-led blueprint for building peace when the weather itself seems to be turning against humanity. And frankly, this corridor is it's a preview of what's coming to the rest of the world.
It really is. These local communities are essentially running the beta test for global climate adaptation.
So to really understand this blueprint, we first need to understand the sheer scale of the stakes. Set the scene for us.
Well, we are looking at a real-time laboratory for human survival. Let's establish the baseline facts from the data here. Since 1980, Uganda has seen a 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature increase.
Wow, since just 1980. Yeah. And the projections suggest a further rise of 2 degrees over the next 50 years.
That's massive.
It is. This isn't just a slight warming where you turn on the air conditioning. It is a fundamental alteration of the ecosystem. The rains fail, the soil degrades.
And there's a financial cost to all this too, right?
A staggering one. The economic cost of doing nothing. We're looking at a massive U.S. $3.1 billion to U.S. $5.9 billion annually by 2025.
Those numbers are they're almost too big to comprehend. But I want to move from that macro-level economic view down to the human reality on the ground.
A lived experience.
Yeah, we need to explore exactly how a shifting climate actually translates into violence. Because, people don't just feel a heat wave and randomly decide to start a war.
Right, it's not a direct biological reaction to heat.
No, it's like an intense game of musical chairs, but the climate keeps removing the chairs, the water and the pasture, and that forces everyone to fight over whatever is left.
That's a really good way to visualize it.
But help me clarify a massive misconception here, because I think a lot of people assume that climate change directly causes this conflict. Like, is the heat itself the direct trigger?
What's fascinating here is that the Mercy Corps data explicitly corrects that assumption. Climate change is not a direct test for violence.
Okay.
It creates a cascading chain reaction. First, you have the environmental impacts. So prolonged droughts, erratic rainfall, the literal shrinking of grazing lands.
The chairs being removed.
Exactly.
Okay.
Second, those environmental impacts lead to intense socioeconomic tensions. You have these pastoralist communities whose entire livelihood depends on cattle.
Right.
And suddenly they're migrating into areas they don't usually go just to find a patch of green grass. That intensifies the competition over whatever resources are left.
So everyone is squeezed together.
Yeah. And then third, that tension significantly increases the risk of conflict. This risk becomes exponential in areas that already suffer from high poverty, weak governance, and, historical pre-existing social tensions.
So it's not the cause, it's a threat multiplier.
Precisely. It's a threat multiplier.
And that threat multiplier has a very specific demographic impact, too. I was looking at the vulnerability assessment in the report, and the hidden victims in this chain reaction are determined almost entirely by gender.
The dynamics there are incredibly stark.
They really are. Resource scarcity creates immense economic instability, and that places massive pressure on men whose identity and status are entirely tied to their herds.
Right. In a pastoralist society, the herd is everything.
It's everything. So when the herd dies, they lose their traditional livelihoods and their societal standing. And tragically, the data shows that this specific economic frustration often translates into a sharp spike in domestic violence.
The entire social fabric fractures under that kind of pressure, and it forces a restructuring of daily life that, unfortunately, hits women and girls the hardest.
Right, because meanwhile, the local water sources have dried up, so women and girls are forced to travel much, much longer distances just to find water and firewood for basic survival.
And we're talking miles of walking through unsecured territory.
Miles. And that journey exposes them to severe physical health risks and drastically increases their vulnerability to gender-based violence from rival groups or bandits.
Not to mention the direct mechanical impact on education.
Oh, yeah. Talk about that for a second.
Well, when resources dry up and the family economy contracts, girls are disproportionately pulled out of school. It's simple, brutal math for a family in crisis.
They just need all hands on deck.
Exactly. They are forced to prioritize household labor, sending daughters to fetch water or tend to the remaining animals just to survive the day-to-day.
Man.
So you can see the direct line here. A lack of rain translates into a lost education for an entire generation of girls.
So if resource scarcity is the catalyst for all of this violence and societal breakdown, how do you intervene before the violence actually starts?
Because clearly you can't just make it rain.
Right. You can't control the weather. Which brings us to the solution side of the CCLAP program. They operate on this three-track mediation architecture.
Track 1 is about inclusive knowledge building.
Yeah, so equipping women, men, youth, and elders with the tools to engage in sustainable solutions and decision-making around climate adaptation. But wait, I need to stop you there.
Go ahead.
Look, inclusive knowledge building sounds great in a UN conference room.
It does.
It looks fantastic on a glossy brochure. But how does a seminar actually stop two desperate armed groups from killing each other over a literal watering hole in the dirt?
And that skepticism is entirely justified. It's exactly where Track 2 comes in.
Okay, what is Track 2?
Track 2 is cross-border resource governance. This is the mechanism that takes those conference room concepts and applies them to the dirt.
The actual ground.
Right. The program facilitates what are called Natural Resource Sharing Agreements, or NRSAs. Instead of abstract concepts about climate, they negotiate the actual physical terms of survival.
Okay, give me an example of how that works.
There's a documented success story in the report about a cross-border forum that secured the Turkana-Karamoja grazing corridors. And the genius of it was that it wasn't just about grass.
Oh, what else was it about?
The agreement ensured that if one group was allowed to cross the border to graze, they also got safe access to essential social services.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, including health centers and markets in the towns of Kamia and Kalapata. They explicitly tied access to natural resources to the economic survival of the host community. It's a reciprocal trade.
Okay, that makes total sense. You're creating a system where my survival depends on your survival, so it's in my best interest not to attack you.
Exactly. It aligns their incentives.
But, and I think this is important, the report is also incredibly nuanced about the limits of this top-down approach. Because that same Kamion and Kalapata forum didn't solve everything.
No, it didn't.
It completely failed to resolve the specific conflict between the Iyo and the Turkana people in the Nawanto's Greenbelt.
Right, that was a major sticking point.
To me, that proves that broad, sweeping agreements drawn on a map are great, but they absolutely require hyperlocal dialogue to address unique grievances.
That failure in the Nawanto's Greenbelt is exactly why top-down treaties collapse. The treaty guaranteed grazing rights on a macro level, but it completely ignored the historical context.
What was the context there?
Well, the NER are largely a marginalized, often farming and foraging community, while the Turkana are pastoralists. You can't just draw a line on a map, declare an area a shared grazing zone, and expect a century of highly specific land use tension to vanish.
Right, because their needs are fundamentally different.
Broad agreements must be nested within deeply local realities.
Which brings us perfectly to Track 3, structural governance reform. If the top-down treaty cracks, what's the backup plan?
This is where CCLAP builds upon an earlier USAID-funded program called ECOSIL.
Yeah, the goal here is to shift the default conflict resolution mechanism away from essentially grabbing rifles. Instead, they are building an entirely new infrastructure for peace from the ground up.
And they're doing this by actively utilizing women's peace forums, trauma healing groups, and community-led livestock mediation to handle disputes.
The mechanism of those women's peace forums is brilliant.
It really is. It leverages the social capital of the very people who suffer the most from the violence.
Right, because women often communicate across tribal lines at markets or boreholes. They gather intelligence on brewing tensions or, impending cattle raids.
By formalizing these forums, they create an early warning radar system. They can intervene through family and social structures, negotiating a de-escalation before the young men ever pick up their weapons.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If these local communities are successfully solving their own problems using these peace forums, how do the international organizations funding them actually know it's working?
Ah, the measurement problem.
Right. Because organizations like the Austrian Development Agency, ADA, they need to see results to keep the funding flowing. There's this thesis in the report, governance improvements before violence drops.
It is arguably the most methodologically significant claim in the entire stack of sources we are looking at.
I think the best way to understand measuring peace building is to compare it to starting a new fitness routine.
Okay, I like this.
Think about it. You start lifting weights, you change your diet, you're building a lot of muscle, and your cardiovascular health drastically improves. You feel significantly healthier.
Right, you're doing all the right things.
Exactly. All of this internal architecture is being rebuilt long before the actual number on the weight scale drops. But if your doctor only looks at that scale, they'd see your weight hasn't changed and tell you the whole routine is a massive failure.
That is the perfect way to frame the mechanism of a lagging indicator. Because in the peace-building world, the number on the scale is the incident count.
The actual recorded drop in violent events or cattle raids?
Yes, standard valuation metrics are completely obsessed with incident counts. But violence is a lagging indicator. It is the very last thing to change.
It happens at the very end of that bank-run chain reaction we talked about earlier.
Exactly. And international donor cycles usually operate on these tight 24 to 36-month timelines.
Which is nothing in the grand scheme of things.
It's a blink of an eye. So they fund a program, wait 2 years, and look at the incident count. Because violence hasn't dropped yet, they completely miss the earlier invisible gains.
The muscle being built.
Yes. They miss the improved governance quality, the rebuilding of trust, and the community's newfound capacity to sit down and negotiate a dispute before it escalates.
So the ICISL program proved that you have to assess the lived experiences of these people. You have to measure the muscle they are building, not just the weight on the scale.
Which is a much harder thing to measure.
For sure. They interviewed community members about the two-way dynamic of climate and conflict, showing how they exacerbate each other, and measured the increase in community trust and dispute resolution capacity.
The implications for donors are huge here.
Yeah.
If you rely solely on conventional results frameworks, just counting the number of violent clashes over a 2-year period, you will systematically undervalue climate peace-building interventions.
You're just looking at the wrong data points.
You are measuring the wrong part of the timeline, and you risk defunding a successful program right before it actually stops the violence.
Okay, so we've looked at the local mechanics and the donor measurement problem. Let's expand outward from the Karamoja-Turkana corridor, because these communities don't exist in a vacuum.
They certainly don't.
They are subject to massive external forces and international frameworks. For instance, the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, the DPPA, has a whole framework making climate-informed mediation a formal priority.
Which sounds very official.
It does. But wait, if the UN is pushing this from the top down in New York or Geneva, isn't there a huge risk of international groups dictating terms to local pastoralists? I mean, if a Western diplomat tells a Ugandan herder how to share water, that seems like a recipe for immediate rejection.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is exactly the risk the UN guidance itself flags. A process that looks externally driven will instantly undercut local ownership.
It just breeds resentment.
The moment it feels like colonial-era map drawing, it fails. But CCLP actively mitigates this by partnering directly with local grassroots organizations.
Like who?
Groups like Narwoa, CAMPTA, and SAPCON. Rather than bringing in foreign consultants, they fund local coalitions of women leaders and rural development workers who actually live in the dust and understand the terrain.
They rely on community-led resource mapping.
Precisely.
So the people drawing the map are the ones who actually have to walk it.
That's it, exactly.
Oh.
And there's broad literature backing this up. A recent study on Mali's inner Niger Delta proved that for peace building to work in these fragile environments, it must build upon customary systems and equitable, locally recognized land institutions.
It can't just be a photo op.
It cannot just be for optics. The World Bank Independent Evaluation Group confirms this too. They call it the Governance Resilience Nexus.
The governance resilience nexus, which basically means that managing natural resources through domestic and regional policy actually builds the community's resilience to weather shocks.
Yes, and the UN guidance adds another crucial layer. You have to climate-proof these agreements.
You mean in what,
You
exactly?
have to design them so they survive worsening weather.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to that Nowonto's greenbelt failure we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
Corridor-level agreements have to stand the climate test over time, meaning they need a built-in mechanism to renegotiate when the river inevitably dries up.
But even with all this brilliant architecture, the local partners, the peace forums, the climate-proof agreements, we have to look at the unresolved gaps, the harsh reality that threatens to tear it all down.
The wild cards.
Yeah. Research from Spark highlights the structural drivers of land insecurity here. The pastoralists' traditional governance systems are struggling because key grazing areas, specifically the ones close to reliable water sources, are being actively converted for other uses.
And those are the exact zones where the conflicts concentrate.
Plus, there are some massive wildcards threatening the success of this entire blueprint.
These are the external pressures that local mediation simply wasn't designed to handle. A women's peace forum is incredibly effective at stopping a local dispute, but it cannot stop macroeconomic forces.
Right. Let's look at the first massive wildcard. The influx of weapons from South Sudan. It entirely reduces the community's ability to peacefully manage migrations.
It changes the entire power dynamic.
The mechanism is terrifyingly simple. A peace treaty means absolutely nothing if teenagers suddenly have access to cheap, black market assault rifles. Armed actors simply aren't bound by these civilian agreements. They can take what they want by force.
And the second wildcard is elite capture. UNDP research shows that local politicians are actively exploiting old, contentious colonial land boundaries.
Oh, wow. So they're digging up old maps.
Exactly. They resurrect these ancient map disputes to create disunity, turning communities against each other just to secure their own voting blocks and political power.
They are artificially creating an us versus them dynamic where resource sharing used to exist.
Just for political gain.
That's incredibly frustrating. And the third wild card, the discovery of oil in Turkana. Suddenly you have extractive economy pressures layered on top of a fragile pastoral resource-sharing framework.
It's a totally different scale of money and power.
You can't migrate your cattle along a traditional centuries-old route if an international oil company has just fenced it off to build a pipeline.
And all of these wildcards, the weapons, the politicians, the oil, bring us to the ultimate question of scale.
Right, because how do you fight that?
Well, the Austrian Development Agency funding model is, relatively speaking, small. If these local conventions and peace forums are going to survive the onslaught of these external pressures, they cannot just remain isolated donor-funded projects.
They need permanent backing.
They must be permanently woven into government frameworks. Specifically, they need to be institutionalized within Uganda's National Development Frameworks, the NDPII, and Kenya's County Integrated Development Plans.
So the local governments have to adopt these peace forums as their official method of governance, funding them with tax dollars rather than relying on, foreign aid cycles.
Exactly. It has to become part of the state apparatus.
So what does this all mean? If you take away one thing from this deep dive, it's that the CCLAT program provides a rare, coherent example of how to integrate climate adaptation and conflict prevention into a single, cohesive action plan at the community level.
They aren't treating the weather and war as two separate diplomatic issues.
No, they recognize that out in the borderlands, they are exactly the same thing. But the great challenge going forward is that measurement paradox we talked about. We have to fundamentally redefine how we measure the slow, quiet building of trust, that internal muscle before the violence ever drops, or we risk abandoning these communities right before they succeed.
And looking forward, there's an entirely new angle we haven't touched on yet, but it's the inevitable next step of everything we've discussed today. Well, the entire premise of climate-informed mediation assumes that the conflict is localized. But if climate change is the ultimate instigator, the invisible force removing the chairs from the room, it raises a profound legal question.
Okay.
If the weather is the weapon driving this violence, who ultimately takes the blame? Will we eventually see a world where international courts hold top carbon-emitting nations legally responsible for local cattle raid violence in Uganda?
Wow.
Could the victims of a climate-driven conflict in the Turkana corridor eventually sue multinational oil companies at The Hague for fundamentally altering their ecosystem and sparking the violence? It moves the responsibility from the local herder directly to the global polluter.
That is, I mean, it's an incredibly provocative thought. When the land itself is erased, the search for justice is going to look for the people who turned up the heat. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep asking those hard questions, keep looking for the hidden connections in the world around you, and we'll see you next time.